There are men who become rich, and then there are men who become legends. Gene Autry was both. But here is the thing about legends. They leave behind more questions than answers. When the spotlight finally goes dark, when the last song fades, and the horse rides off without a rider, what remains? For Gene Autry, what remained was a fortune so vast it could hardly be counted, a name so powerful it still echoes across Hollywood hills, and a family story so unusual, so tangled with grief and surprise and unexpected turns, that even now, nearly 3 decades after his death, people are still trying to make sense of it all. No children, 2 marriages, a 34-year age gap that raised every eyebrow in California, and a legacy that had to be carried forward by people nobody expected. This is not just the story of how Gene Autry made his money. This is the story of what happened to all of it, and to the people left holding it 28 years later. To understand what Gene Autry left behind, you first have to understand what he built, and more importantly, how he built it. Because this was not a man born into comfort. This was not someone who stumbled into wealth through a lucky connection or a golden handshake. Gene Autry earned every single dollar through a combination of relentless work, sharp instinct, and a stubbornness that could outlast almost any obstacle the world threw at him. He was born on September 29, 1907, in Tioga, Texas, to a family that knew more about hardship than happiness. His father was a horse trader whose deals rarely held together, and his mother was a fragile woman whose health cast a quiet shadow over every room she entered. The family moved constantly, bouncing between Texas and Oklahoma, always chasing a stability that seemed to stay just one county ahead of them. When his father landed in prison for bootlegging around 1918, the floor dropped out entirely. Gene was barely 11 years old, but he was already doing the work of someone much older, holding the household together with his hands and his will. By the time he was a teenager, he had worked farm labor, shined shoes, swept barbershops, and hauled baggage at a railroad depot, not because he wanted adventure, but because the family simply needed the money. And yet, right in the middle of all that grinding survival, something extraordinary happened. In 1919, at around 12 years old, he saved exactly $8 from baling hay on his uncle's farm. $8 earned 5 cents at a time in brutal summer heat, stacking 100 bales on some days. That $8 could have gone toward food or household expenses. Instead, he ordered a guitar from the Sears Roebuck catalog and paid cash. That guitar was not a luxury. For Gene Autry, it was a declaration. It was the first decision he ever made entirely for himself, and it changed the entire direction of his life. He started playing at local cafes and school events, mixing hymns with popular tunes, earning tips that sometimes reached $1 a night. He picked up yodeling techniques he heard from singers like Jimmy Rogers on the radio, and the combination of his natural voice, his tireless practice, and his instinct for reading a crowd started to separate him from every other young man with a guitar in rural Oklahoma. But Autry was never just a dreamer. He was also a planner. While other young men his age were content to play music for tips, he was already learning telegraph operation at the railroad depot in Ravia, earning real wages by age 17, pushing his monthly income to $30 and then beyond. He understood something early that most people take decades to learn, that talent opens doors, but skill and discipline keep them open. By 1925, he was earning up to $75 a month in railroad work, sending money back home, keeping his family afloat, while quietly building toward something bigger. The break everyone remembers came during a night shift at the St. Louis-San Francisco Railway Depot in Chelsea, Oklahoma. He was strumming his guitar and softly yodeling into the empty station when a famous visitor walked in to send a telegram. It was Will Rogers, the Oklahoma cowboy humorist, whose name was known across the entire country. Rogers stopped, listened, and told the young telegraph operator that a voice like his belonged on the radio, not behind wires. That moment planted a seed that Gene Autry never stopped watering. The Singing Cowboy became a movie star, and the movie star became something nobody in Hollywood had quite seen before, a genuine business empire disguised inside a 10-gallon hat. From 1934 to 1953, Autry made 93 feature films, often churning out several in a single year. He was consistently ranked as one of the top box office draws in America. His horse, Champion, became nearly as famous as he was. His records sold by the hundreds of thousands. His radio show, Melody Ranch, ran for more than 600 episodes over nearly 2 decades. And his Christmas recording of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer in 1949, which he almost did not make because he doubted the song, became one of the best-selling Christmas singles in history. But the part of Gene Autry's story that most people overlook, the part that truly explains the scale of what he left behind, is not the performing. It is the owning. While his peers were cashing their studio paychecks and spending freely, Autry was reading contracts, filing lawsuits, and buying assets. He fought Republic Pictures in court over his right to fair pay, and then fought them again over television rights to his film library. He launched his own production company, Flying Productions, in 1951, so he could control his own content and keep the profits that studios would otherwise swallow whole. He understood, before most people in Hollywood did, that ownership was the only form of security that could outlast fame. In 1952, he bought a controlling stake in a Los Angeles radio station for around $800,000, and that purchase became the foundation of Golden West Broadcasters, a chain of stations that spread up the West Coast. Then, in January 1964, he made one of the boldest moves of his financial life, purchasing KTLA Television in Los Angeles from Paramount Pictures for exactly $12 million. People in the industry thought it was a questionable bet at the time. 18 years later, in 1982, that station sold for $245 million. That is not luck. That is vision. And then there was baseball. On December 20th, 1960, Gene Autry was awarded the expansion franchise for the Los Angeles Angels, a Major League Baseball team that debuted the following April. He owned that team for decades, and it became perhaps the most public and beloved piece of his business identity in his later years. When he showed up at the stadium, fans did not see a media mogul or a real estate investor. They saw the cowboy, the same one who had sung to them on Saturday afternoons when they were children. But behind that warm, familiar image was a man who had structured his holdings with extraordinary care. Media stations, real estate, hotels, oil interests, and land holdings across California and beyond. By the time Forbes began ranking the wealthiest Americans in the 1990s, Gene Autry appeared on that list. His fortune was not simply large. It was diversified, durable, and designed to last. And because he had no children, no natural heirs, no family dynasty waiting in the wings, the question of what would happen to all of it was one that would take on enormous significance after he was gone. When Ina May Spivey Autry died of cancer on May 19, 1980, after nearly 48 years of marriage, Gene Autry was 72 years old and devastated in a way that people around him had never seen before. She had been his partner through the lean radio years and the Hollywood explosion, through the war and the comeback, through every business deal and every personal loss. She had pushed him toward Hollywood in 1934 when he doubted himself, and she had convinced him to record Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer in 1949 when he thought the song was not worth his time. Without her quiet encouragement, the shape of his career might have looked entirely different. After her death, he withdrew from public life almost completely. The grief was genuine and visible to anyone who knew him. He had built a fortune, owned a baseball team, and held a place in American culture that very few entertainers ever reach, but none of it filled the absence that Ina left behind. He stayed away from social events for months. Friends described a man who seemed genuinely unsure what came next. What came next surprised everyone. Just 14 months after Ina's death, on July 19, 1981, Gene Autry married again. His new wife was Jacqueline Elam, known as Jackie, a woman he had first met in 1964 at a bank in Palm Springs, where she had worked her way up from switchboard operator to vice president by the age of 32. He was 73 years old on their wedding day. She was 39. The 34-year age gap generated headlines across Hollywood and beyond, and opinions ranged widely, from genuine celebration to sharp skepticism. But people who actually knew Jackie Elam described a woman of serious intelligence and real ability. She was not a performer or a social figure looking for proximity to fame. She was a financial professional who had spent her career building practical expertise in banking and management. She and Gene had no children together, just as he and Ina had none. And that fact, the complete absence of direct heirs in either marriage, would ultimately define what happened to the Autry legacy in the decades after his death. Gene Autry died on October 2, 1998, at his home in Studio City, Los Angeles, from lymphoma, just 3 days after turning 91. At the time of his death, Forbes still listed him among America's 400 wealthiest individuals. The empire he had built, from a boy with an $8 guitar to a man with radio stations, a baseball team, and a vast real estate portfolio, was intact, enormous, and in need of a steward. Jackie Autry became that steward. 28 years after Gene Autry's death, his name is still everywhere, even if most people under 40 encounter it without fully realizing who it belongs to. The Autry Museum of the American West in Griffith Park, Los Angeles, stands as perhaps the most enduring physical monument to the man and the world he represented. It is not simply a shrine to a singing cowboy. It is a genuine cultural institution dedicated to the history and stories of the American West in all its complexity. The settlers, the indigenous peoples, the myths, the realities, the art, and the artifacts. The museum draws scholars and tourists alike, and it holds collections of historical significance far beyond anything Gene Autry himself collected during his lifetime. Jackie Autry has remained deeply connected to the museum and the Autry Foundation throughout the years since his death. She took on the role of preserving and expanding the institution with a seriousness and dedication that silenced many of the early skeptics who had questioned the second marriage. Rather than simply managing an estate, she built something. The Autry Museum has grown in collections, programming, and scholarly reputation, becoming one of the more respected cultural institutions on the West Coast. That growth did not happen by accident. It happened because someone with genuine capability was guiding it. The Los Angeles Angels baseball franchise, which Gene Autry owned for decades and loved with a genuine fan's passion, passed through several ownership changes in the years following his death. He had begun the process himself in the mid-1990s, selling a portion of the team to Disney in a deal that set up a full transition after his passing. The team went through changes in ownership, name, and direction, eventually becoming the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim, and then simply the Los Angeles Angels once more. The story of the franchise in the 28 years since Gene Autry's death includes both heartbreak and celebration. A World Series championship in 2002 that many fans felt honored his memory, and long stretches of struggle that tested the loyalty of the fan base he helped build. His music endures in ways that cross generations. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer still plays every December in homes across America, on radio stations and streaming platforms, often heard by people who have no idea that the voice belongs to a man who also flew cargo planes over the Himalayas and once fought a federal lawsuit against a major Hollywood studio. Back in the Saddle Again shows up in film soundtracks, television shows, and nostalgia programming. His recordings have been reissued and repackaged repeatedly, and his influence on the genre of country western music and on the entire archetype of the singing cowboy remains foundational. The Hollywood Walk of Fame still holds 5 stars with his name, 1 for radio, 1 for recording, 1 for motion pictures, 1 for television, and 1 for live performance. Nobody else has ever matched all 5 categories. That distinction still stands 28 years after his death, and it is not merely a piece of Hollywood trivia. It is a factual record of how thoroughly one man penetrated every major medium of 20th century American entertainment. There is a particular kind of story that gets told about wealthy men with no children, and it usually involves bitter legal battles, confused estates, and fortunes scattered to the wind. Gene Autry's story is different, and the difference is instructive. Because he built his empire with the same deliberate care that he brought to every other aspect of his career, the absence of direct heirs did not create chaos. It created an opportunity for something rarer, a fortune redirected entirely toward public purpose. The Autry Foundation, which holds and manages resources in support of the museum and various Western heritage initiatives, reflects the priorities he expressed during his lifetime. He was genuinely interested in preserving the history of the West, not as a romanticized myth, but as a living, complicated cultural story. The foundation has supported educational programming, archival preservation, and community engagement in ways that extend far beyond any single exhibit or donation. What his story ultimately teaches, seen from the distance of nearly 3 decades, is something about the relationship between wealth and purpose. Gene Autry never went to college. He never had a formal business education. He came from poverty so real that saving $8 felt like a gamble. And yet he built one of the most diversified and durable personal fortunes in American entertainment history. He did it by owning things, by fighting for what he believed was rightfully his, and by understanding that the spotlight eventually moves on, but ownership does not. His family, in the traditional sense of the word, children, grandchildren, a bloodline carrying his name forward, never existed. But in a broader sense, the institutions he funded, the music he recorded, the cultural memory he helped shape, and the museum that now carries his name into the 21st century represent a kind of legacy that most families with dynasties and heirs never managed to build. The name Autry does not belong to a family line anymore. It belongs to the public. And perhaps for a man who spent his entire life performing for audiences, who measured his worth in part by how many people were listening, that is exactly the way he would have wanted it. Gene Autry started with $8 and a dream that had no business succeeding. He survived poverty, a broken family, the Great Depression, a world war, studio politics, legal battles, personal grief, and the relentless pressure of reinventing himself across 7 decades of public life. He died at 91, one of the wealthiest entertainers America had ever produced, with no children to carry his name and no simple answer to the question of what happens next. 28 years later, the answer is still unfolding. A museum that keeps growing, a foundation that keeps giving, a music catalog that keeps playing, a baseball legacy that keeps living in the memories of fans who never forgot the man who stood in the stands cheering alongside them, and a second wife, now well into her later years, who stepped into an impossible role and carried it with more dignity and capability than almost anyone expected. The boy who saved $8 grew into the man who owned the radio stations, the television network, the baseball team, and the real estate spread across California like a map of ambition. And when he left all of it not to a family, but to a story that 28 years later is still being told.